She was moments from death in the storm, until an angel carried her to safety in the nick of time. It was supposed to be a routine drive home, the kind of evening that blends into 1,000 others, with nothing remarkable to set it apart. My day had been long and tiring, filled with meetings that went nowhere and deadlines that loomed closer with every passing minute. As I started my car and pulled onto the highway, the first drops of rain began to fall. A light sprinkle at first, nothing to worry about. The kind of rain that makes the world feel fresh and alive. But by the time I reached the outskirts of town, the weather had taken a sudden, vicious turn. The sky, once painted in shades of orange and purple from the setting sun, was now an ominous gray-black mass. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the horizon in sharp, jagged streaks. Thunder followed, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the earth itself. The rain intensified, pounding against my windshield with a ferocity that made the wipers almost useless. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The road, already slick from the rain, had become a treacherous path of puddles and flooded patches. Visibility was next to nothing, and the usual landmarks I relied on had vanished into the storm's misty shroud. Every now and then, a gust of wind would buffet my car, making it sway on the narrow road. "Just get home," I muttered to myself, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of the storm. Just a little farther. As I turned onto the winding country road that led to my house, I spotted something up ahead. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games with me. But as I drew closer, my heart skipped a beat. There, in the middle of the road, was a figure. A person. They were staggering, barely able to stand, their arms outstretched as if trying to balance against the raging wind. For a moment, panic gripped me. What was someone doing out here in this storm? The nearest town was miles away, and there was no reason anyone should be walking along this desolate stretch of road, especially in weather like this. I honked my horn, hoping they would move out of the way. But they didn't. Instead, they stumbled and fell to their knees, their head bowing as if the weight of the storm was too much for them to bear. "Damn it," I muttered, slamming on the brakes. My tires skidded slightly on the wet asphalt, and my car came to a halt just a few feet away from the figure. Heart pounding, I threw the car in a park and grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. The rain hit me like icy needles as I stepped out, the wind tugging at my clothes and nearly pulling the door out of my hand. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice barely carrying over the roar of the storm. "Are you okay?" No response. The person didn't even lift their head. I approached cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the sheets of rain. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. She looked fragile, almost ghostly, her skin pale and her movements sluggish. "Hey," I said again, softer this time, crouching down beside her. "Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" She lifted her head slightly, her eyes barely open. They were gray, stormy like the sky above us. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She looked so weak, so helpless, that it sent a jolt of fear through me. She wasn't just caught in the storm. She was in serious trouble. "I'm going to help you, okay?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to get you out of here." I slid my arms under hers, lifting her as gently as I could. She was lighter than I expected, her body limp and unresponsive. The rain continued to pour, soaking us both to the bone as I half carried, half dragged her to my car. Her head lolled against my shoulder, and I could feel her shivering uncontrollably. The cold was biting, and I knew we didn't have much time. Once I got her into the passenger seat, I cranked up the heat and wrapped her in the emergency blanket I kept in the trunk. She didn't resist, her head resting against the window as her eyes fluttered closed. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin felt ice cold to the touch. "Stay with me," I said, glancing over at her as I pulled back onto the road. "You're going to be okay." The truth was I wasn't so sure. The storm was worsening by the second, and the roads were quickly becoming impassable. Water pooled in low-lying areas, and fallen branches littered the asphalt. The wind howled, rattling the car and making it feel like we were driving through the heart of a hurricane. I kept talking to her, more for my own sake than hers. "What were you doing out there? Do you live nearby? Were you trying to get somewhere?" She didn't respond, her head lolling to the side, as if she were on the verge of passing out. My mind raced with questions and possibilities. Had her car broken down? Had she gotten lost? None of it made sense, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. The only thing that mattered was getting her somewhere safe. As I navigated the treacherous road, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. There was something about her, something I couldn't quite put into words. She felt out of place, like she didn't belong in this storm or on this road. It was as if she had been plucked from another time or place and dropped here, right in front of me. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. I glanced over at her again, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable, that it was hard to believe she had survived this long in the storm. "We're almost there," I said, more to myself than to her. "Just hang on a little longer." The words felt hollow as the rain continued to hammer against the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. In the distance, I could see the road ahead starting to flood, the water rushing like a miniature river. My options were dwindling, and I knew I couldn't risk going much farther. I had to make a decision, and fast. The storm was relentless. Rain poured in torrents, and the wind screamed like it was alive, hurling debris across the road and slamming into the car with a force that made the frame shudder. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to push forward no matter what. But the road ahead was becoming more treacherous with every passing second, and deep down, I knew continuing was a gamble we couldn't afford to take. I glanced at the woman beside me. She was slumped in the passenger seat, wrapped in the emergency blanket. Her face was as pale as a ghost, her lips tinged with blue. The heater was on full blast, but it didn't seem to be helping. She was still shivering, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her breathing was shallow, each exhale a faint whisper of life. "Hang on," I said, my voice trembling. "Just hold on." She didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her head resting against the window. A flicker of panic rose in my chest. I had no idea how long she'd been out in the storm or how close she was to hypothermia, but it was clear she needed help, and fast. Staying on the road was no longer an option. I had to find shelter, somewhere we could ride out the storm until it was safe to travel again. My mind raced through the possibilities. There were no houses nearby, no gas stations or rest stops for miles. The only place I could think of was the old cabin deep in the woods. It had belonged to my grandfather, a small, rustic retreat he'd built years ago as a getaway from the chaos of town life. After he passed, it had fallen into disuse, but I still had the keys on my keyring. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof, but it was our best chance. Decision made. I gripped the wheel tightly and turned onto the dirt road that led into the woods. The tires slipped and skidded on the muddy path, the headlights cutting through the darkness and rain like a pair of weak flashlights. Branches swayed wildly in the wind, some snapping and crashing to the ground. My heart pounded with every turn, every dip in the road. One wrong move, and we'd be stuck out here, at the mercy of the storm. The woman let out a faint groan, her head shifting slightly. It was the first sign of life she'd shown in what felt like forever. I stole a quick glance at her, relief washing over me. She was still hanging on, but barely. "We're almost there," I said, more to reassure myself than her. Just a little farther. The cabin came into view at last, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the storm. It was small and unassuming, a single-story structure with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. To anyone else, it might have looked like a shack, but to me, it was a beacon of hope. I pulled up as close as I could, the car's headlights illuminating the front door. The wind was even stronger here, howling through the trees and shaking the cabin's wooden walls. I turned off the engine and grabbed the flashlight, bracing myself for the next challenge. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Time to get you inside." She didn't respond, but I could see her chest rising and falling faintly. That was enough. I stepped out of the car, the rain instantly soaking me to the bone. The cold was sharp, biting into my skin as I opened the passenger door. She was barely conscious, her body limp as I lifted her into my arms. She felt impossibly light, her head resting against my shoulder. The trek to the front door felt like an eternity. Every step was a struggle against the wind, which seemed determined to knock us both to the ground. By the time I reached the porch, I was drenched and shivering, my arms aching from the effort. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers numb and clumsy, before finally getting the door open. The cabin was dark and musty, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and neglect. I kicked the door shut behind me and carried her to the couch, laying her down as gently as I could. She stirred slightly, her eyes flickering open for a moment before closing again. I pulled the emergency blanket tighter around her and ran to the fireplace. The cabin might have been old and neglected, but it still had a working fireplace and a stack of firewood my grandfather had left behind. I grabbed a few logs and kindling, my hands shaking as I worked to get a fire going. It took longer than I'd hoped, but eventually the flames roared to life, casting a warm glow across the room. I turned back to her, crouching beside the couch. Her color hadn't improved much, but her shivering had slowed. That had to be a good sign, right? I touched her forehead. It was cold and clammy. Panic surged again, but I pushed it down. She needed me to stay calm. "Hey," I said softly, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "Can you hear me?" Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. I leaned closer, straining to hear. After a moment, I caught it a single faint word. "Cold." "I know," I said, my throat tightening. "But you're safe now. We'll get you warmed up." I grabbed a second blanket from the cabinet and draped it over her, tucking it around her carefully. The fire was starting to warm the room, and I hoped it would be enough to help her recover. I couldn't stop thinking about how close she'd been to death out there. If I hadn't found her, if I'd been a few minutes later, the thought made me shudder. I forced myself to focus on the present. She was here now, alive. That was all that mattered. As the minutes passed, her breathing grew steadier, and the color slowly returned to her cheeks. I stayed by her side, watching her closely, ready to act if anything changed. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling and rain battering against the windows. But inside the cabin, it was quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and her soft, even breaths. I didn't know who she was or how she'd ended up in the middle of that road, but one thing was clear. Fate had brought her to me, and I wasn't about to let her slip away. The storm outside didn't relent. If anything, it seemed to grow angrier, the wind howling through the trees and slamming against the walls of the cabin like a living thing trying to get inside. But in here, we were safe for now. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the small space with much-needed warmth. The woman on the couch was still unconscious, but her breathing had steadied, and her face no longer had that frightening pallor. She looked peaceful, despite everything. Her damp hair framed her face, and her hands, which I'd carefully wrapped in one of the cabin's old towels, had started to regain some color. I pulled another log from the stack and fed it to the fire, watching as the flames greedily consumed it. It felt strange, being here again after so many years. This cabin had been my grandfather's pride and joy, a sanctuary he'd built with his own hands. As a kid, I'd spent countless weekends here, fishing in the nearby creek, hiking the forest trails, and listening to his stories about the world he'd seen before settling in our little town. After he passed, the cabin fell out of use. Life got busy, and I hadn't been back in years. But tonight it felt like the perfect refuge. I glanced back at the woman. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and I let out a small breath of relief. At least she was stable, for now. I couldn't ignore the questions swirling in my mind, though. Who was she? Why had she been out in the storm? And how had she ended up in the middle of that road, miles from the nearest house or town? Guess we'll figure that out when you wake up, I murmured to myself. The rain hammered against the roof, and I decided to check the rest of the cabin. It had been so long since anyone had used it, and I wasn't sure what kind of shape it was in. The small kitchen was dusty but functional, stocked with a few cans of food that were probably expired but might still be edible in a pinch. The bedroom in the back was just as I remembered it, with a simple wooden bed and an old quilt my grandmother had made years ago. I grabbed a couple of extra blankets from the closet and brought them back to the main room. The firelight cast a soft glow over the woman's face, and for a moment, she almost didn't look real, like a porcelain doll, fragile and still. I draped one of the blankets over her, making sure she was as warm as possible, and then sat down in the armchair by the fire. My clothes were still damp, and the chill from the storm had seeped into my bones. I peeled off my wet jacket and boots, setting them near the fire to dry. The warmth of the flames was a welcome comfort, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her. I couldn't shake the image of her stumbling in the road, the rain and wind battering her frail body. What had she been running from? Or was she just lost, caught in the storm by accident? The sound of her stirring pulled me from my thoughts. I sat up straighter, watching as her eyelids fluttered. For a moment, I thought she might wake, but then she settled again, letting out a soft sigh. She was still out, but at least she seemed more at ease now. I decided to make some tea. The old kettle was still here, along with a few dusty packets of herbal tea my grandfather had probably left behind. I boiled some water on the wood stove, the steam rising in lazy spirals, and poured myself a mug. The first sip was comforting, the warmth spreading through me and easing the tension in my shoulders. I glanced at the couch again. You'd probably like some of this, I said quietly, half hoping she'd wake up and respond. But she remained still. Outside, the storm raged on. Lightning lit up the windows, followed by a thunderclap so loud it shook the cabin. I jumped, spilling a bit of tea on my hand. Cursing under my breath, I set the mug down and grabbed a towel to clean up the mess. When I turned back, her eyes were open. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Her gray eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. She tried to sit up, but her body was still weak, and she sank back against the cushions with a small whimper. "Hey, it's okay," I said quickly, holding up my hands in what I hoped was a reassuring gesture. "You're safe. You're in a cabin, out of the storm." She didn't say anything, her gaze darting around the room as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. I could see her hands trembling, and I grabbed one of the towels to wrap around them. Her eyes drifted to the fire, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of relief in her expression. She shifted slightly under the blankets, and I could tell the warmth was starting to reach her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "You're welcome," I replied, feeling a small smile tug at the corners of my mouth. "Just glad I got to you in time." She didn't respond, her eyes closing again as exhaustion took over. I stayed by the fire, keeping watch, the storm outside a reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. Whatever had brought her here, it wasn't over. But for now, she was safe, and that was all that mattered. The hours ticked by slowly, the storm outside showing no sign of easing. The wind continued to roar through the trees, and the rain lashed against the windows with unrelenting force. The fire was our only comfort, its warm glow pushing back the chill that seemed to seep into the cabin from every corner. I kept feeding it logs, one after another, determined to keep the room warm enough for her to recover. The woman, Elise, as I would later learn her name, remained mostly still, her breathing steady but shallow. Occasionally, her lips moved in her sleep, murmuring words I couldn't understand. Dreams, perhaps, or fragments of memory struggling to resurface. I didn't wake her. She needed rest more than anything. I checked my phone, hoping for some signal, but it was a useless brick in my hand. No bars, no chance of calling for help. Even if there was a clearing in the storm tomorrow, I wasn't sure if the roads would be passable. We were stuck here, for better or worse. At least we had shelter. The cabin creaked in protest as the wind battered it, and I glanced toward the door. It was holding for now, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the storm wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It felt alive, as if it had a will of its own. That thought made me shiver despite the warmth of the fire. I turned my attention back to Elise. Her face was still pale, but her color was improving. She didn't look as fragile as she had when I found her on the road. I leaned back in the armchair, letting out a slow breath. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to relax, just a little. That's when I heard it. A knock at the door. I froze, the mug of tea halfway to my lips. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Surely no one else could be out here in this storm. The road was impassable, the conditions deadly. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My first instinct was to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there. I set the mug down carefully and stood, my eyes locked on the door. The room felt colder all of a sudden, the warmth of the fire unable to keep the creeping chill at bay. My mind raced. Who could it be? A neighbor? Unlikely, given how isolated this cabin was. A traveler? Lost in the storm? Maybe. But how would they have made it this far? Who's there? I called, my voice steady despite the unease tightening my chest. No answer. Just the sound of the storm raging outside. I glanced at Elise. She was still asleep, oblivious to what was happening. I didn't want to wake her. She was in no condition to deal with whatever this was. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the flashlight from the table and approached the door. Hello? I called again, louder this time. The knocks came again, more insistent now. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, but I couldn't ignore it either. What if someone really needed help? I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, just enough to peer outside. A man stood on the porch, his form illuminated by the faint glow of the flashlight. He was tall, his shoulders broad, and he wore a long, white coat that seemed strangely untouched by the rain. His face was calm, almost serene, and his eyes, deep, piercing, met mine without hesitation. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low and soothing, yet somehow carrying over the roar of the storm. I hesitated. There was something about him that felt off, not threatening, exactly, but otherworldly. Still, I couldn't leave him out there in the storm. I stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," I said reluctantly. He stepped inside, and I shut the door behind him. Despite the wet and cold outside, he didn't seem to carry any of it with him. His coat was dry, his boots free of mud. It was as if the storm had parted to let him through. Who are you? I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze shifted to Elise. His expression softened, and he walked over to where she lay. Every instinct told me to stop him, but something about his demeanor kept me rooted to the spot. She's very weak, he said, kneeling beside her. His hand hovered over her forehead, and I thought I saw a faint glow, just for a moment before he pulled back. What are you doing? I demanded, stepping closer. Helping, he said simply, glancing up at me with those piercing eyes. She's been through more than you realize. The storm wasn't her only enemy tonight. What does that mean? I asked, my unease growing. Who are you? He stood, his presence commanding yet strangely comforting. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, he said with a faint smile. But know this, she'll recover. You've done well to bring her here. The storm can't touch her now. I opened my mouth to ask another question, but before I could speak, he turned and walked toward the door. Panic surged in my chest. Wait, where are you going? Back, he said, as if that explained everything. She doesn't need me anymore. I followed him to the door, my mind racing with questions. Who are you? Why did you come here? He paused, his hand on the doorknob. Someone who was sent to help. That's all you need to know. Before I could protest, he stepped outside. The storm should have swallowed him instantly, but it didn't. He moved through it as if it wasn't even there, his white coat standing out like a beacon against the darkness. Within seconds, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the night. My heart pounded, and my mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, I closed the door and turned back to the room. Elise was awake. Her eyes, storm gray and filled with confusion, met mine. Who was that? She asked weakly. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was shake my head. I don't know, I said honestly. But I think he saved you. She looked at me for a long moment, then closed her eyes again, exhaustion taking over. I sank into the armchair, my thoughts a whirlwind. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the air felt different, lighter somehow, safer. Whoever that man was, he'd come when we needed him most. And though I didn't understand it, I was grateful. The storm's fury continued outside, but inside the cabin, a strange calm had settled. The man in white, whoever or whatever he was, had come and gone, leaving more questions than answers. I sat in the armchair, staring at the fire, the warmth barely penetrating the chill that lingered in my chest. Elise was awake now, though still weak. She hadn't said much since she asked about the man. Her storm-gray eyes seemed distant, as if she were searching for answers in a memory she couldn't quite grasp. I finally broke the silence. How are you feeling? She glanced at me, her gaze lingering for a moment before she spoke. Better, I think. Warmer. That's good, I said, offering a small smile. You gave me a scare out there. Her brow furrowed, and she looked down at the blanket wrapped around her. I don't remember much. Just the storm. It was so loud. And the rain, it was everywhere. And then nothing. You don't remember being on the road? I asked gently. Or how you got there? She shook her head, frustration flickering across her face. No, it's all a blur. I remember driving. There was a flash of lightning, and then, I don't know, I nodded slowly, not wanting to press her too hard. It's okay. You've been through a lot. Your memory will come back when it's ready. She fell silent again, staring into the fire. I watched her carefully, trying to piece together what little I knew. Her car had likely been swept off the road, and she'd somehow escaped, on foot, no less, in one of the worst storms I'd ever seen. That alone was incredible. But then there was the man. His presence didn't fit into any logical explanation. Who was he? And how had he known to come here? Elise broke the silence this time. The man, was he real? Her question caught me off guard. I think so, I said, though my voice wavered with uncertainty. He knocked on the door, came in like he knew exactly what to do. And then he helped you. Her eyes met mine, wide and searching. Help me how? I hesitated. He just touched your forehead, said you were weak, but that you'd recover. She pressed her lips together, her gaze dropping to her hands. I felt something, warmth, like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was faint, but it was there. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. I'd felt it too, the strange, calming presence that seemed to follow him, even in the middle of the storm. I don't know who he was, I admitted, but he didn't seem normal. Not normal, she echoed, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips despite the weariness in her voice. That's one way to put it. We both fell quiet, the fire crackling between us. I wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into what she felt or what I'd seen, but I didn't want to overwhelm her. She was still pale, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every ounce of energy was precious. I don't know if you believe in that sort of thing, I said after a moment, but do you think he could have been an angel? Her head tilted slightly, her expression thoughtful. An angel? She repeated softly, almost as if testing the word on her tongue. I don't know. I don't know what to believe, but I do know I felt safe. Like nothing could hurt me as long as he was here. That struck a chord with me. It was exactly how I'd felt too. Despite the storm raging outside and the questions flooding my mind, his presence had brought a sense of peace that was undeniable. Elise leaned back against the couch, her eyes drifting to the window where the rain still streaked down the glass. I've never been a religious person, she said quietly. But maybe there's more out there than we understand. Yeah, I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe. For the next hour, we talked in fits and starts. I told her about finding her on the road, how I'd brought her to the cabin, and how bad the storm had been. She listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but her memory of the events leading up to her collapse remained a blank. Every time she tried to recall something, it seemed to frustrate her more. What about you? She asked suddenly, catching me off guard. Me? I asked. Yeah, she said, her voice steadier now. Why were you out there in the storm? Oh. I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling a little sheepish. I was just trying to get home. I didn't realize how bad the storm was until I was already in it. She nodded slowly. And then you stopped. You could have just driven past. Her words caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but closed it again, unsure of what to say. It hadn't even occurred to me to keep driving. When I'd seen her, the only thought in my mind was to help. I couldn't just leave you there, I said finally. I don't think I could have lived with myself if I had. She smiled faintly, her eyes softening. Thank you for stopping, for everything. You don't have to thank me, I said quickly. I just did what anyone would have done. Not everyone would have, she said quietly, her gaze dropping again. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and let the silence stretch between us. Outside, the storm had begun to ease. The wind was no longer howling, and the rain had softened to a steady patter. The worst of it seemed to be over. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was well past midnight, but I didn't feel tired. Adrenaline and curiosity kept me awake, my thoughts still spinning with everything that had happened. Elise seemed to sense my restlessness. What happens now? She asked. We wait, I said, until the storm passes and the roads are clear. Then we figure out what to do next. She nodded, her gaze distant again. I just hope I can remember what happened before. You will, I said with more confidence than I felt. Your memory's just foggy from everything you've been through. Give it time. She didn't respond, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. I didn't blame her. The whole night felt surreal, like a dream we'd wake up from at any moment. But the warmth of the fire, the soft crackling of the wood, and the presence of someone else reminded me that this was real. Strange, unexplainable, but real. As the storm continued to calm, I found myself wondering about the man in white. Where had he gone? How had he found us? And would we ever see him again? Something told me we might. By the time dawn broke, the storm had finally run its course. The wind had died down to a gentle breeze, and the rain had tapered off into a soft drizzle, leaving the world outside the cabin quiet and still. The air smelled fresh and earthy, the kind of scent that only comes after a heavy storm. I stood by the window, staring out at the waterlogged forest, my mind still replaying the events of the night. Behind me, Elise stirred. I turned to see her sitting up on the couch, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked better, still pale, but her eyes were clearer, and her movements less sluggish. "How are you feeling?" I asked, stepping away from the window. She gave me a small smile. "Better. Still tired, but better." "That's good," I said, returning the smile. "The storm's finally over. Looks like we made it through." Her gaze flickered to the window, taking in the soft gray light of morning. "It's hard to believe," she said quietly. "After everything last night, it feels surreal." "Yeah," I agreed, sitting down in the armchair across from her. "It does." For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the crackling of the dying fire the only sound in the room. The questions that had haunted me all night still lingered, but now they felt less urgent. The storm was gone, and Elise was safe. That was all that mattered. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in white had left more than just an impression on us. He'd left a mystery, one that neither of us could ignore. "Do you remember anything else?" I asked gently. "About what happened before I found you?" Elise shook her head, her expression tinged with frustration. "Not really. Just flashes. I remember driving and seeing the lightning. There was a loud noise and then nothing. The next thing I remember is waking up here." "You said your car went off the road," I prompted, hoping to jog her memory. "Do you remember how?" She frowned, her hands tightening around the blanket. "I think there was water. A lot of water. The road was flooding, and I couldn't see where I was going. I must have misjudged and ended up in the ditch." "That makes sense," I said, nodding. "The roads were terrible last night. You're lucky you got out." "Am I?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I don't even know how I got out. I don't remember walking in the rain or collapsing on the road. It's like I just appeared there." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I've been thinking the same thing, but hadn't wanted to say it out loud. How had she survived the storm long enough for me to find her? How had she ended up in the middle of the road, miles from where her car must have gone off? And then there was the man. His presence felt even more unexplainable in the light of day. Who or what had he been? An angel? A good Samaritan? Someone who had known Elise? None of it made sense, but every time I thought about him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been more than human. "Elise," I began carefully, "do you think he might have been the reason you're still alive?" She looked at me sharply, her storm gray eyes narrowing. "You mean the man? The one who came last night?" I nodded. "Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but the timing, it's too perfect. He shows up right when you're at your weakest, does whatever it was he did, and then disappears." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared into the fire, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she said, "I don't know. Maybe. I felt something when he touched me, like a warmth spreading through me. It wasn't just physical, it felt deeper, like it reached into my soul." Her words struck a chord in me. I'd felt it too, that strange warmth that filled the cabin when he was here. It wasn't something I could explain or rationalize, but it was undeniable. "I think he saved you," I said, my voice steady. "In more ways than one." Elise met my gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and fear. "But who was he? And why would he help me?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But maybe it doesn't matter. He was here when we needed him. That's what counts." She nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You're right. I guess I should just be grateful." "You should," I said with a small smile. We both should. We spent the next hour tidying up the cabin and preparing to leave. The storm had left a mess outside. Branches and debris littered the ground, and the dirt road was more of a muddy swamp than a passable path. But the air was cool and fresh, and the sunlight filtering through the clouds felt like a promise of better days ahead. As we worked, Elise seemed to grow stronger, her movements more confident. She even smiled a few times, though there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. I didn't press her. Whatever she was going through, she needed time to process it. When we were ready to leave, I helped her into the car and started the engine. The road was rough, but we managed to make it back to the main highway without too much trouble. The world felt different now, cleaner, quieter, as if the storm had washed away more than just the debris. As we drove, Elise stared out the window, her expression contemplative. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" she asked. I considered her question carefully. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But if we do, I'll be ready with more questions." She chuckled softly, a sound that warmed my heart. "Yeah, me too." The rest of the drive was quiet but comfortable. When we reached the edge of town, I pulled over and turned to her. "Where can I take you?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "My mom's house. It's not far from here." I nodded, following her directions until we pulled up in front of a modest brick home. She turned to me, her expression serious. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "For everything." "You're welcome," I said, smiling. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" she asked. "If you ever figure out who he was, or if you ever see him again, you let me know." She laughed softly, the sound light and free. "Deal." As she walked up to the house, I watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and longing. The storm had brought us together, and now it was over, but something told me this wasn't the end of our story. Not by a long shot.